The moment George sneered those venomous words, "Then never come back, sign the divorce papers and leave," I knew my life was about to change forever. I stood in the opulent living room of the house we shared, a place that never truly felt like home. The walls, once symbols of security, now seemed to close in on me, suffocating me with memories of a marriage that had been nothing but a charade. Reflecting on the years spent with George, I realized how he had skillfully donned a mask of perfection in public, while in private, he was a tyrant. The duality of his character was so profound that it left me questioning my own sanity. George, the charming and successful trader, admired by all, was a facade. The real George was a man who relished in belittling me, his wife, behind closed doors. Our relationship hadn't always been this way. In college, George was the epitome of kindness, his patience seemingly boundless. He wooed me with his gentle demeanor, and before I knew it, I was entranced, agreeing to marry him. It was only after the vows were exchanged that his true nature surfaced, like a predator revealing itself. I became his prey, trapped in a web of emotional abuse and manipulation. Each day was a battle, a struggle to appease a man who seemed impossible to please. His words were like daggers, each one striking deeper than the last. "Hey, what's with that bland food?" he would bark. My apologies and attempts at explanation were met with scorn. "No excuses," he'd snap back. My spirit withered under his constant criticism. I longed to reach out, to share my pain with friends, but George, ever the controller, severed those ties too. He convinced them I was the problem, turning my cries for help into whispers lost in the wind. I once dared to ask George to let me visit my mother's grave. His response was a cold, heartless refusal, stripping away the last shred of humanity I thought he possessed. "Why would you show your face to someone who's already gone?" he scoffed, his eyes not leaving the financial newspaper he was reading. The realization that I was nothing more than an object to him was my breaking point. I demanded a divorce, a plea I thought he would dismiss. Instead, he flung the divorce papers at me with a malicious glee. "Sign these and leave," he commanded. In that moment, I felt a surge of freedom. I signed the papers without a second thought, severing the chains that bound me to George. The divorce was finalized with a swift brutality that mirrored our entire relationship. Leaving the house that had been my prison, I embarked on a journey back to my mother's home, the only place I hoped to find some solace. Little did I know that this decision would lead me to a reunion that would change my life even more dramatically. The dilapidated state of my mother's house was a stark contrast to the life of luxury I had just left. Standing before it, memories of a happier time flooded back. But the nostalgia was interrupted by a sudden thud behind me. Turning around, I saw an elderly man in a gray suit, a face from the past yet unfamiliar. "Are you alive?" he exclaimed, rushing towards me with an urgency that left me baffled. Before I could react, he embraced me, his tears soaking my shoulder. "I heard the news of your death. I couldn't sit still. I finally found you," he sobbed, his voice laden with a lifetime of regret and longing. His embrace, though unexpected, carried the warmth and familiarity of a long-lost connection. "Could it be, Dad?" I whispered, a mixture of hope and disbelief in my voice. He pulled back, his tear-streaked face searching mine for recognition. "Elizabeth? Are you Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice trembling. In that embrace, I felt the echoes of my childhood, the faint memories of a father's love that had been absent for so long. His name was Matthew, my father, who had vanished from my life when I was just a child. As we reconnected, the pieces of my past began to fall into place. Matthew's story unfolded, revealing a man torn away from his family by circumstances beyond his control. He spoke of a love for my mother that never waned, a love that was cut short by forces that pulled him away, leaving a void in both our lives. Sitting in the dusty living room of my childhood home, I shared with him the agonizing years I spent with George. My father listened, his expression a mix of sorrow and simmering anger. "I should have been there for you," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. As I recounted the cruelty and manipulation I endured, Matthew's demeanor shifted from sorrow to resolve. "We can't let him get away with this," he declared, his eyes now reflecting a determination that mirrored my own. It was then that we decided to take action, to seek justice and retribution for the years of suffering I endured at the hands of George. Our plan was simple yet bold. We would gather evidence of George's abuse, both physical and emotional, and expose him for the monster he was. Matthew, with his newfound resolve, was ready to stand by my side, to fight the battle that we both knew was long overdue. As the sun set on my first day back in my childhood home, I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. With my father by my side, I was ready to face my past and reclaim my future. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. George would no longer control my life. It was time for retribution, and I was ready to fight. The morning sun cast a new light on the old house, bringing with it a sense of hope and determination. As Matthew and I sat at the kitchen table, laden with years of dust and memories, we began to devise our plan of action. Matthew was not just a forgotten father trying to make amends. He had resources and connections that could prove invaluable. "Elizabeth, we need evidence. Solid, indisputable evidence of George's abuse," Matthew said, his voice firm, yet tinged with a father's concern. I nodded, feeling a surge of empowerment. For years, I had documented George's abuse in secret, a diary of my pain hidden in the depths of my personal belongings. Now it was time to bring it into the light. As I shared my diary entries with Matthew, his face darkened with each word. The extent of my suffering, laid bare in those pages, fueled a fire within him. "We'll need more than this," he stated resolutely. "Do you have anything else? Any recordings or messages?" "Yes," I replied, a sense of relief washing over me. I had recorded some of George's tirades, his venomous words captured in the secrecy of my pocket. It was a risky move, but one driven by a desperate need for validation, for proof that I was not the one at fault. Matthew listened to the recordings, his expression a mix of pain and anger. "This is good, Elizabeth. This is what we need to bring him down," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a storm of emotions. Our conversation turned to George's professional life, a facade of success and respectability. "He's involved in some shady dealings at his company," I revealed. "I've overheard conversations, seen documents. He's embezzling funds." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "We can use this. It's time George faces the consequences of his actions, both personal and professional." The resolve in his voice was unwavering, a stark contrast to the man who had once left us behind. The next step in our plan required reaching out to an unexpected ally, my ex-father-in-law, Mr. Patterson. I hesitated, the thought of involving George's parents in our plan weighing heavily on me. They had always been kind, and I feared dragging them into this sordid affair. "Elizabeth, we need all the help we can get," Matthew urged. "If they know the truth, they might support us." Gathering my courage, I called Mr. Patterson, inviting him over under the guise of catching up. When he arrived, the surprise on his face was evident. "Elizabeth, it's been so long. You look different," he said, a hint of concern in his voice. "Mr. Patterson, there's something you need to know about George," I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I recounted the years of abuse, the emotional scars that still lingered. Mr. Patterson listened, his expression shifting from shock to anger. "I had no idea. How could George do this?" he exclaimed, his voice shaking with emotion. "And the embezzlement. This is unacceptable. We need to act." With Mr. Patterson on our side, our plan gained momentum. We pooled our resources, gathering more evidence against George. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, painting a picture of a man who had deceived everyone around him. As we sat together, plotting our next move, I felt a sense of camaraderie, a bond formed through shared adversity. Together we were stronger, united in our quest for justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would bring George's reign of terror to an end. The time for retribution was at hand, and we were ready to strike. The day of reckoning arrived. We had arranged to meet George at a neutral location, a quiet cafe where there would be witnesses to prevent any outburst from him. Mr. Patterson, Matthew, and I sat at a corner table, awaiting George's arrival with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. George walked in, his arrogance filling the room. Spotting us, he approached with a sneer. "What is this? An intervention?" he mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Sit down, George. We need to talk," Mr. Patterson said, his voice stern, devoid of the warmth he once showed his son. George's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Talk about what? Elizabeth, if this is about more money, you can forget it." "It's not about money, George," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It's about your actions, the abuse and the theft." George laughed, a cold, harsh sound. Abuse, Elizabeth, you always were dramatic, and theft, you're delusional. I held his gaze, my resolve unwavering. No, George, I'm not delusional. We have proof. I slid the folder containing the diary entries and recordings across the table. His face paled as he glanced through the documents, his facade beginning to crack. This is nonsense, he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. Matthew leaned forward, his eyes hard. We also know about the embezzlement, George. You've been stealing from your company. George's composure shattered. You can't prove anything? He hissed. Mr. Patterson interjected. We can and we will. I can't believe I raised a son who could do such things. The confrontation escalated, with George alternating between denial and bluster. But the evidence was irrefutable. His mask of respectability had slipped, revealing the monster beneath. As we left the cafe, George's parting words were a venomous threat. You'll regret this, he snarled. But we walked away, united and stronger for having faced him. The path to justice was clear, and George's reign of terror was coming to an end. The aftermath of the confrontation was a whirlwind of activity. With the evidence in hand, we approached George's company with the allegations of embezzlement. The company acted swiftly, launching an internal investigation that corroborated our claims. George was fired, his career in ruins. Simultaneously, I pursued legal action for alimony and damages for the years of abuse. The court proceedings were grueling, but I stood my ground, bolstered by the support of Matthew and Mr. Patterson. The diary and recordings played a crucial role, painting a vivid picture of the life I had endured with George. In the end, justice was served. The court ruled in my favor, granting a substantial settlement that would secure my financial independence. George, now a pariah, faced not only the loss of his career, but also the scorn of those he had deceived. The victory was bittersweet. While I had won my freedom and vindication, the years lost to George's abuse could never be reclaimed. Yet there was a sense of closure, a feeling that a chapter of my life had been conclusively closed. With the legal battles behind me, I turned my focus to rebuilding my life. Matthew and I, now reconciled, decided to renovate my mother's house, transforming it into a home filled with love and memories, free from the shadows of the past. The journey had been long and fraught with pain, but I emerged stronger, with a newfound sense of self and purpose. The scars of the past would always be a part of me, but they no longer defined me. I was ready to start anew, to live a life of my own choosing, unencumbered by the specter of George. The future was mine to shape, and I embraced it with open arms and a hopeful heart. In the tranquil setting of the renovated house, now a haven of peace and new beginnings, I sat with Matthew on the porch, reflecting on our journey. The evening air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, a testament to the new life we had cultivated. Elizabeth, do you ever regret it? Confronting George, exposing him? Matthew asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. I paused, considering his question. No, Dad, I don't regret it. It was difficult, but it needed to be done. For too long, I let him control my life, my happiness. No more, I replied, my voice firm, echoing the resolve I felt inside. Matthew nodded, a look of pride crossing his face. You're strong, Elizabeth, stronger than you ever realized. The conversation shifted to our future plans. I expressed a desire to use my experience to help others who might be suffering in silence. I want to be a voice for those who feel voiceless, to help them find the strength to seek help, I said, my determination clear. Matthew supported my ambition, offering to help in any way he could. Let's do it together, Elizabeth. Let's make a difference. Our plans were interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Mr. Patterson. He arrived with a somber expression, requesting a private word with me. We stepped aside, and he shared news that sent a chill down my spine. Elizabeth, it's about George, he began, his voice heavy. He's spiraling out of control. After losing his job and reputation, he's been seen wandering the streets, shouting your name, blaming you for his downfall. A mix of emotions surged within me, fear, pity, and a lingering anger. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Patterson, but he brought this upon himself. His actions, his choices led him here, I responded, my heart heavy, but my resolve unwavering. Mr. Patterson nodded, understanding my stance. I know, Elizabeth. I just thought you should be aware. We're handling it, trying to get him the help he needs. As Mr. Patterson left, I stood there, a sense of finality washing over me. George's downfall was his own doing, a consequence of his actions and choices. While I hoped he would find some semblance of peace, I knew my path lay elsewhere. Turning back to Matthew, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Our experiences had brought us closer, and together we were embarking on a new chapter, one filled with hope and the promise of making a difference. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun set on the horizon, I realized that this journey had not only been about revenge or justice. It had been a journey of self-discovery, of finding my voice and reclaiming my life. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape, and I stepped into it with a heart full of hope and a spirit unbroken. The moving van sat idled by the curb, its rear door gaping open like a hungry maw. I stared in disbelief as the last remnants of my life were carted out of the house I had called home for 30 years. "What is going on here?" I demanded, hands trembling as I gripped the strap of my purse. Elliot turned towards me, his expression one of feigned surprise. The smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth said it all. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Harper, you're back early," he said coolly, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his chinos. I bristled at his casual tone. "Don't Harper me. What have you done?" Before he could respond, a lilting voice cut through the tension. "There you are, Elliot, darling." A statuesque blonde in a ridiculously short sundress slinked up beside him, looping her arm through his. My stomach twisted into a knot as her identity became clear. Marla, Elliot's mistress from the office, the one he had sworn was ancient history. I should have known better than to trust his lies. You sold our home?" I choked out the words, praying this was some cruel joke. "After everything we've been through together?" Elliot opened his mouth, but I barreled on, anger and hurt swelling within me. "The sacrifices I made when your business failed, caring for your awful mother when she fell ill, pouring my life into this house, into our marriage." I was nearly shouting now, hot tears streaking my cheeks. Marla wrapped her arms around Elliot in a sickening display of possession. "Don't get hysterical, Harper. It's just business." Just business. After 30 years of partnership, of struggling and persevering side by side, he was tossing me aside like a used rag. For her. I rounded on Elliot, squaring my shoulders. "You lying, cheating snake, you're willing to destroy everything we built together for this?" Elliot avoided my gaze, the muscles in his jaw twitching. He knew he had been caught red-handed in his web of deceit. The seconds ticked by in silence, the only sound the sudden clatter as the movers heaved the last of our belongings into the van. It was really happening. The man I had loved and trusted above all else had betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable. Marla sneered at me over Elliot's shoulder. "Time to move on, Harper. This is our new beginning." Their smugness was more than I could bear. Squaring my shoulders, I jutted my chin defiantly at the pair. "You want a new beginning? Fine, but mark my words, this isn't over." Turning on my heel, I stalked away from the home I had poured my heart and soul into, leaving the shattered remains of my marriage behind. The game was on. Elliot and his mistress had started a war, and I would be damned if I went down without a fight. I barely slept that night, that the image of Elliot smugly carrying on with his mistress scorched into my mind. How could the man I had loved, the father of my children, be so callous and cruel? My anger simmered as I paced the guest room of Alex's apartment, the temporary living situation doing nothing to soften the sting of Elliot's betrayal. I had given that man everything, my unwavering support through hard times, my love and loyalty for 3 decades. And this was how he repaid me? The shrill ring of my cell phone sliced through the tense silence. Jenna's name flashed across the screen. "Mom?" Her voice wobbled with unshed tears. "Is it true what Alex told me? Dad left you for some young thing?" My chest tightened. Having to explain this nightmare to my children was almost worse than living through it myself. They had always looked up to their father, despite his litany of shortcomings over the years. "I'm so sorry, honey. Your father and we're getting divorced." I cringed at how matter-of-fact the words sounded, like I was reporting groceries rather than the imminent dissolution of my marriage. Angry silence crackled down the line. When Jenna spoke again, her tone was low and uncompromising. "That selfish bastard, after everything you sacrificed for him and this family?" She broke off in a choked sob. "Mom, I'm coming over. We're gonna get through this together. Thank you, sweetie, I murmured, feeling a surge of pride at my daughter's fierce loyalty. At least I could count on my children, despite their father's despicable actions. A few hours later, Jenna burst into the apartment, red-faced and bristling. Alex sat slouched on the sofa, his expression one of carefully restrained rage. That low-life piece of scum, Jenna spat, flinging herself into the armchair beside me. Throwing away 30 years of marriage for a cheap fling? Unfreaking believable. Jenna, Alex warned in a low voice. No, Alex, I won't stay quiet. He humiliated Mom in the worst way. She wheeled towards me, eyes blazing. Please tell me you're taking him for every last penny. I studied my daughter's fierce protectiveness and loyalty, my heart swelling despite the misery of my circumstances. This was the family I cared about, the ones who had my back no matter what. Squaring my shoulders, I returned Jenna's determined stare. You're damn right I am. If that rat bastard Elliot thinks he can just discard me and our marriage, he has another thing coming. My gaze slid towards Alex, who gave a somber nod of agreement. A muscle twitched in his clenched jaw. We're with you every step of the way, Mom. Just let us know whatever you need. In that moment, I felt a surge of resolve. Elliot and his mistress had detonated a bomb that shattered my life into pieces, but if he thought I would go down without a fight, he was gravely mistaken. It was time to show my soon-to-be ex-husband exactly why hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Squaring my shoulders, I looked my children in the eyes. Here's what we're going to do. The divorce proceedings were uglier than I could have imagined. Elliot fought me tooth and nail, contesting everything from asset division to alimony. His smug arrogance in the courtroom made my blood boil. Your Honor, my client has devoted her entire adult life to supporting Mr. Monroe's endeavors, often at great personal cost, my lawyer argued, throwing a pointed look at Elliot. She put her career on hold to raise their children, manage the household, and provide emotional support through failed business ventures. She is more than entitled to an equitable share of the marital assets. Elliot's eyes narrowed into serpentine slits. That condescending sneer I knew all too well twisted his lips. He seemed to forget I sat just a few feet away, watching his every arrogant micro-expression. With all due respect, his lawyer oozed, Mr. Monroe's recent financial windfall stems from the prudent sale of the marital home he purchased prior to the marriage. My client's new business partner, he threw a deferential nod at that blonde bimbo Marla, simply provided the funds to unlock the asset's latent value. Mrs. Monroe's demands are exorbitant, given her minimal contributions. You lying sack of scum, I mentally hurled at my soon-to-be ex-husband. I burned with impotent rage, wanting nothing more than to hurl the nearest heavy object at his insufferably smug face. The arrogance. To dismiss 3 decades of selfless partnership, putting his wants ahead of my own dreams, raising our children almost single-handedly, and dragging his worthless carcass back from the brink of financial ruin as minimal contributions. White-hot fury lanced through me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Alex leaning forward, his hands knotted into white-knuckled fists atop his knees. Jenna put a calming hand on his arm, her own eyes glinting with outrage. Mom's the one who kept this family afloat while you were off chasing yet another get-rich-quick scheme, Alex hissed under his breath, low enough for just me to hear. Don't you dare try to rewrite history in that condescending way. I squeezed his hand in gratitude, stoking the fires of my own resolve. We had fought too hard, sacrificed too much of our lives, to let Elliot sweep it all under the rug now. If he thought I would go down without a fight, he had underestimated the wrong woman. The following days and weeks were consumed by a whirlwind of paperwork and legal appointments. With Alex and Jenna's assistance, I pored over financial statements, compiled records, and documented everything. No stone was left unturned. Gone were the days of meekly accepting Elliot's decisions, of surrendering pieces of myself for his desires and ego. I would expose every lie, every despicable act for the world to see. Elliot Monroe was about to learn a brutal lesson. You didn't get to spend 30 years leeching off a spouse's sacrifices and loyalty, discarding them like a used rag for your own selfish gratification without suffering immense consequences. Not on my watch. It was a new day. Armed with evidence and sheer determination, I was finally taking control of my destiny. Elliot's reckoning was coming, and nothing would stand in my way. The Westbrook Charity Gala was usually the highlight of my social calendar, a chance to dress up, rub elbows with the town's elite, and raise money for good causes. This year, my motivations were decidedly different. From the moment I arrived, eyes followed me like hawks, whispers rippling through the crowd. Word of Elliot's scandalous betrayal had spread like wildfire thanks to the divorce proceedings. My cheeks burned, but I lifted my chin defiantly, gliding across the marble floor with practiced grace. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted them. Elliot looking disarmingly handsome in his tuxedo, with that blonde bimbo Marla draped over his arm like a damn trophy. She stuck out like a sore thumb in that garish red dress that clung inappropriately to every curve. My fists clenched involuntarily at my sides. How dare they show their faces here after demolishing everything we'd built? The sheer arrogance of it made my blood boil. Elliot caught my withering stare and quickly averted his eyes, suddenly finding the crystal chandelier overhead fascinating. Good, let the craven weasel squirm under my gaze for once. Marla, however, sneered back at me, her scarlet lips curving into a mocking smile as she ran her ringed fingers along Elliot's arm in a possessive display. My jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. The MC's voice abruptly boomed from the speakers, beckoning everyone to their seats for the program's commencement. I took a fortifying breath, smoothing my hands over my evening gown. It was now or never. Abandoning my usual table, I weaved through the clusters of impeccably dressed guests until I stood front and center on the stage, microphone in hand. "Good evening, everyone," I began in a tone of forced civility. "As you all may know, I'm going through a difficult transition in my personal life currently." Elliot went rigid in his seat, realization dawning across his features. Marla's eyes narrowed to serpentine slits, her over-glossed lips parting in outrage. My voice carried flawlessly to every corner of the vaulted ballroom. My husband of 30 years has chosen to abandoning our marriage vows, our family, and everything we built together in pursuit of. I threw Marla a pointed look. More self-indulgent desires. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd like a Mexican wave. Elliot's ruddy face colored even further under the spotlight's glare. While I'm sure he and his new associate are quite proud of their clandestine dalliances, I wouldn't feel right letting such a prominent member of our community get away with such appalling deceptions. Marla shot to her feet, perfectly plucked eyebrows slanted furiously over her pale blue eyes. "How dare you drag us through the mud this way?" she shouted, planting her hands on her canted hips. "This is low, even for you." A vindicated smirk tugged at my lips. "Low?" I echoed over the crowd's stunned gasps. "Low is cheating on your wife of 3 decades and abandoning your family for a cheap fling. Low is lying, gaslighting, and manipulating those closest to you for your own selfish appetites." I leveled my gaze at Marla and the pinched, crimson-faced Elliot behind her. "No, revealing the unvarnished truth about your contemptible actions. That is justice. Maybe next time you'll both think twice before carelessly destroying human lives in pursuit of your transient desires." Turning on my heel, I surrendered the stage to thunderous applause and whistles, watching in satisfaction as Elliot buried his flaming face in his hands. The gloves were off. In front of the entire town, I had drawn the battle lines. Let the war begin. The gavel struck the wooden sound block with a decisive thump, echoing through the courtroom. My hands trembled as Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, shuffling through the stack of documents on his bench. In the matter of the divorce proceedings between Harper Monroe and Elliot Monroe, his voice carried the weight of finality. Elliot sat ramrod straight beside his lawyer, his expression unreadable. I forced myself to meet his gaze, letting none of the turbulent mix of anger, grief, and vindication roiling inside me show. After months of vicious legal battles, falsified financial records, and levels of deception I'd never imagined possible from the man I once loved, it all came down to this moment. My grip tightened around the armrests until my knuckles shone bone white. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, I thereby order Mr. Monroe to pay Mrs. Monroe a lump sum of $4 million. The judge's ruling sliced through the thick tension like a hot knife. In addition, Mrs. Monroe shall receive 60% of the liquid assets and investment portfolios accumulated during the marriage. A guttural sound of disbelief escaped Elliot's lips. His rictus mask of composure finally shattered, giving way to flushed, impotent rage. "Suck on that, you arrogant prick," I mentally hurled at him. "Furthermore," Judge Reynolds spoke over Elliot's sputtering, "Mrs. Monroe is awarded full ownership of the Monroe residence on Summit Hill Road, free and clear of all liens or encumbrances." My heart stuttered in my chest as the enormity hit me. He was giving me back the home Elliot had so gleefully sold out from under me. Our home, the place we had raised our children and built a life together for 30 years, would remain mine. Tears of sheer relief and vindication pricked my eyes. Alex squeezed my hand tightly beside me, a proud smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "That lying snake got exactly what he deserved," he murmured under his breath. Jenna leaned across him and enveloped me in a fierce hug, openly weeping tears of joy. Beyond them, Elliot sat utterly motionless, his face drained of all color. The full weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. As I strode triumphantly from the courtroom to raucous cheers and applause from my friends and supporters, I was vividly reminded of the scorpion and frog fable. Elliot had thoughtlessly stung me, his faithful partner who carried him across the tumultuous waters of life, and now he would drown in the consequences of his treachery. But I intended to do more than simply survive his betrayal. With this ruling, I had been afforded a new lease on life, a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to pursue all the hopes and dreams I had put on hold for that ungrateful bastard. And I would be damned if I didn't take this second chance and run with it full throttle. 6 weeks later, I stood in the marble foyer of my reacquired home, drinking in the warm, familiar surroundings as the moving crew unloaded my belongings. The mover grunts and thuds providing a stark counterpoint to the eerie silence and memories that hung thick in the air. This place had been the backdrop to my once happy marriage, the birthplace of cherished family memories, unbreakable bonds between husband and wife, and dreams of growing old together. Elliot's lies and callous greed had very nearly ripped it all away. But not anymore. Tilting my chin up, I surveyed the cavernous front room, envisioning the fresh start taking shape before me. This house, this life, belonged solely to me and my children now. The shackles of deception and manipulation were finally severed. It was time to reclaim my dignity, my identity, and take that first defiant step into my bold new chapter. Just when I thought I was finally free of Elliot's treachery, the other shoe dropped with a sickening thud. "You're doing what?" I sputtered, gaping at Jenna over the breakfast bar. She slid a sleek brochure across the granite countertop toward me with a grim look. "Dad and Marla are opening up some sort of luxury bed and breakfast." My stomach twisted into a queasy knot as I scanned the high-gloss photos advertising their premier inn and chateau in a pristine mountain setting. I could only imagine how much of my divorce settlement went into funding this mockery. "That arrogant son of a bitch," I hissed under my breath. "The place opens in 3 months," Jenna continued, fire blazing behind her eyes. "Using the cash he swindled from selling our home, no less." Bitter bile burned the back of my throat. Of course that weasel Elliot wouldn't be content until he'd twisted the knife one last time, flaunting his ill-gotten trophy acquisition in a lavish new business venture. It was the ultimate insult. In that fateful moment, something inside me hardened like carbon under immense pressure. Elliot had made his move, ramming home just how little our marriage and my sacrifices had ever meant. The gloves were officially off. "You know what?" I said, looking up at Jenna with a steely determination. "Two can play at this game." Over the next couple weeks, I quietly put my business skills to work. Between the millions from my divorce settlement, unbridled passion, and an unquenchable drive to crush Elliot once and for all, those old familiar thrills of strategizing and building something from the ground up reignited hot in my veins. Before long, the pieces fell into place with impeccable precision, the perfect location secured, permits and licenses filed, and employees hired. Elliot's smug comeuppance had become my singular obsession. Of course, I kept the entire operation strictly under wraps, waiting for the perfect opportunity to skin the cat. That chance arose when Alex called me with a frantic update. "Mom, you'll never guess what. They invited us to some big launch party for their stupid inn. Elliot and his mistress, foolishly dangling their bait. I could taste the sweet promise of revenge on my tongue. Did they now? I purred into the phone. My son's confusion was palpable. 2 weeks later, Elliot and I stood amidst the opulent trappings of his Monroe Inn and Resort launch gala. With a bored flick of the champagne flute, I signaled Alex to join us by the towering picture windows. Elliot's serpentine gaze immediately narrowed with displeasure, so predictable. "I must congratulate you both on this quaint establishment," I began. My tone dripped with sugary condescension. Marla bristled, straightening the tight bodice of her obscene cocktail dress. "Why, Harper, how big of you to join our celebration." Elliot merely stared at me, dumbfounded. "Although, I can't help feeling it's missing something." I paused dramatically, watching fresh color bloom across his cheeks. "Some competition, if you will, to keep you on your toes." "Competition?" His voice finally barked out a brusque response. "What the devil are you talking about?" With a serene smile, I looped my arm through Alex's elbow. "Why don't I show you both instead?" We swept through the ballroom, Elliot and his trampy mistress gawking like hooked fish at our heels. A bank of French doors waited at the opposite end, where the remainder of my crew hovered in anticipation. "Elliot, Marla, welcome to the grand opening of the Chateau Sophia." At my signal, the doors swung wide, revealing the sprawling vista of the property I had meticulously assembled to be bigger, bolder, and infinitely more upscale than their paltry imitation. Their jaws dropped in horror at the sight. "You didn't really think I was going to let you prance around with my life's work unchallenged, did you?" My eyes glittered with malicious glee. As my new employees swarmed the terrace behind me, a messenger arrived with urgent news for Elliot. His backers were pulling funding over the 11th hour competition. The arrogant blowhard gaped at me, the color rapidly draining from his blustered features. I offered a mocking toast of my champagne glass. "To new beginnings, darling. Welcome to the hospitality wars." The opening months of the Chateau Sophia could hardly have gone better. Our elegant, rustic chic accommodations and curated experiences were an immediate hit, drawing rave reviews and becoming the area's hottest destination. In stark contrast, Elliot's half-baked Monroe Inn and Resort limped along in obscurity. Their online listings were littered with scathing critiques, shabby decor, subpar amenities, and painfully amateurish service chief among the complaints. Seeing that arrogant blowhard receive his long-overdue comeuppance was more satisfying than I could have possibly imagined. Each scathing review, every vacant room, and negative press mention further cemented his colossal failures as both a businessman and human being. Every few weeks, I would gather my team for an all-hands meeting to align our strategy. More than once, Elliot's petty attempts at sabotaging my operations through underhanded tactics were uncovered and swiftly neutralized. The bastard tried bribing the Campbell family to leave us a scathing review, Renee, my operations lead, told me one afternoon. A contemptuous sneer twisted her lips, as if a wealthy clan like that would ever sully their reputation for a few measly bucks. I waved a dismissive hand, hiding my vindicated smirk behind a sip of coffee. That's just how low Elliot will stoop. He's flailing desperately to stay afloat, but it won't be enough. Sure enough, it was barely 2 months into our heated battle for hospitality supremacy that the unraveling began. Rumor had it, Elliot was hemorrhaging cash at an unsustainable clip, having wildly underestimated startup costs and failing to gain a foothold in the market. When the foreclosure notices started appearing in the local paper's legal announcements, I couldn't resist a wry smile of triumph. Textbook overconfident arrogance, bulldozing ahead without doing his due diligence. It was so quintessentially Elliot. Later that week, Alex forwarded me a scathing article about the pending closure of the Monroe Inn. Turns out Elliot had stopped paying vendors, staff, and underlying creditors in a desperate bid to keep the facade going. His investors, those few who hadn't already pulled their funding, were going to get hosed. The comments section was a virtual bonfire of schadenfreude, with locals and former patrons alike torching Elliot for his litany of failures. Just desserts for such a prolific liar and cheat. Not long after, I found myself across the polished alderwood desk from the one and only Elliot Monroe. He was noticeably haggard, the last bastions of his smarmy confidence crumbling under the crushing weight of his debacle. I'm destitute, Harper, he admitted in a hoarse tone, unable to meet my unblinking stare. The business, the investors, it's all gone belly up. I have nothing. The disgraced charlatan finally confessing the depths of his depravity should have felt enormously vindicating. Instead, I just felt hollow, numb to the man whose betrayal had nearly decimated my soul. After everything you did to me, to us, I murmured, gesturing between us, did you really think I was just going to roll over and let you win? His jaw clenched, tendons straining beneath his ruddy skin. I leaned forward, holding his gaze with steely determination. Wake up and face reality, Elliot. You're an arrogant, insecure little man whose own reprehensible actions orchestrated this downfall. All I did was give you the chance to reap what you've sown. My office abruptly felt too small, the air heavy with decades of simmering resentments. This confrontation had been a long time coming. Please. The broken whisper escaped Elliot's lips. I waited for the rest, but he seemed to shrink further in on himself, deflating like an untied balloon. In that moment, I realized just how profoundly over him I was. The man had gambled away my love, my loyalty, our life, for his own selfish cravings. He deserved no more of my energy or power. Rising to my feet, I smoothed my hands over my skirt and crossed to the door. I'm afraid there's nothing left to say. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. As Elliot slunk from the office in disgrace, I felt an unfurling sense of finality. Whatever puppet strings had still bound me were severed. My karma delivered. His miserable fate sealed. It was a new beginning in the truest sense. And I had miles more to go before reaching my final form. The warm summer breeze carried the fragrance of freshly bloomed roses and honeysuckle as I stood on the terrace, surveying my personal oasis. After more than a year of stratospheric success with the Chateau Sophia, I had seized the opportunity to expand into a full-service luxury resort and spa. My staff bustled about in crisp uniforms, meticulously prepping for the grand opening gala. Lanterns were strung between marble columns, and sleek white cabanas dotted the immaculate grounds. I inhaled deeply, savoring the sweet air and sense of peaceful accomplishment. This night marked the culmination of a years-long journey, one driven by sheer determination to not just survive betrayal, but to thrive in defiance of it. It's really something, huh, Mom? Alex's voice shook me from my reverie. I turned to find him beaming with pride, Jenna looped through his arm in a chic sundress. Despite the years and tumult we'd endured, my children still stood staunchly by my side. You've built an amazing legacy, one we're all so proud of. Jenna gushed. Emotions swelled in my throat as I pulled them both into a fierce embrace. Just a couple years ago, our family had been in tatters, each of us suffering the devastating blows of Elliot's callous betrayal. We never could have imagined coming out on the other side like this. I couldn't have done any of this without you two, I said gruffly, blinking back happy tears. Your love and support gave me the strength to keep going, no matter what. We stood together in comfortable silence, cherishing the profoundly transformed trajectory of our lives. The agonizing days of despair and hurt were finally behind us. A gentle rap on the terrace doors signaled an arrival. I turned to find Justin, the new director of hospitality operations, hovering with an uncertain look. Apologies for interrupting, Mrs. Monroe, but he's here, asking for you. My stomach clenched instinctively. I already knew who the he in question was. Taking a steadying breath, I nodded for Justin to send him out. No more than a minute later, the terrace doors parted, revealing a shrunken, haggard figure that had once been Elliot Monroe. His expensive suit hung loosely on his diminished frame, his eyes downcast and swallowed by deep hollows. To put it plainly, he looked utterly, irrevocably broken. Elliot, I greeted with cool detachment, nodding to Jenna and Alex. To their credit, they restrained themselves from any outbursts, simply watching on in stone-faced silence. Harper, he began, words failing him as his mouth worked soundlessly. With visible effort, he met my gaze, shame and regret etched into the weathered lines of his face. I just wanted to see the spectacular woman you've become with my own eyes. The strength, the success. You've cemented an enduring legacy while I squandered my own. His laugh was a dejected, hollow rasp. I gambled away the love of my life, my family, in pursuit of cheap vices and ego strokes. A bigger fool has never walked this earth. My first instinct was to rebuff his pathetic wallowing, to dismiss him as easily as swatting a fly, but some deeper pang of crushed hopes gave me pause. Maybe in another life, another reality where he made different choices, things could have turned out so differently for us. But that path was forever closed to him now, his misery entirely self-wrought. "You're right about one thing," I said after a loaded pause. "This life, this empire, is mine now. One I built from the ashes of the world you burnt to the ground." Elliot staggered back slightly, absorbing the weight of my condemnation. "But I won't have you polluting it with your boorishness any longer," I continued, mustering every fiber of dignity. "Tonight, I'm surrounded by the people who matter most, my loyal family, my driven team, my esteemed guests. You've been excised from this existence entirely." I pierced him with a final, unwavering stare. "Now, get off my property before I have security remove you." Without another word, the shell of the man who had once been my husband turned and shambled away in disgrace. A profound sense of closure blossomed within me as I watched him disappear into the gloaming. At long last, I had severed the final tether binding me to my anguished past. Ahead lay an open field of possibility, and a hard-won second chance to cultivate the life I deserved. A new chapter was finally beginning.